In a glittering Manhattan ballroom filled with the city's most powerful elite, a young woman collapses from exhaustion and hunger, only to be caught mid-fall by the most dangerous man in the room. Marco DeLuca doesn't save people. He destroys them. But when Lena Hart opens her eyes in his arms, something shifts in the cold heart of New York's most feared figure. What begins as a simple act of catching someone falling becomes an obsession that will either save them both or consume them entirely. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lena and Marco's story travels. And if this opening grabbed you, hit that like button and stay until the very end. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this goes. The crystal chandeliers of the Vandermeer Hotel ballroom cast fractured light across 500 of Manhattan's most influential faces, each one worth more than Lena Hart would earn in a lifetime. She moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible in her simple black dress and practical flats, carrying a tray of champagne flutes that cost more per bottle than her monthly rent. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was surrounded by abundance while her own stomach cramped with hunger she'd been ignoring for 2 days. Lena had learned to make herself small in spaces like this. As a last-minute hire through a catering agency, she wasn't supposed to be noticed, wasn't supposed to exist beyond the function she served. Pick up empty glasses, offer fresh drinks, smile politely, disappear. The same survival skills that had carried her through 3 years of art school on scholarships and student loans, working every side job she could find while her trust fund classmates complained about the authenticity of struggle in their conceptual pieces. The gala was a blur of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, of conversations conducted in that particular tone of casual wealth where six-figure donations were discussed with the same energy most people reserved for ordering coffee. Lena had stopped listening to the words hours ago. They all blended together anyway. Another charity, another cause, another opportunity for Manhattan's elite to see and be seen while congratulating themselves on their generosity. She'd been on her feet for 6 hours straight, and the room had started tilting slightly at the edges. Lena blinked hard, trying to clear the gray spots creeping into her peripheral vision. Not now, not here. She couldn't afford to lose this gig. The agency paid cash at the end of the night, and she needed every dollar. Her student loan payment was 3 weeks overdue. Her landlord had started leaving pointed notes under her door, and she'd been rationing ramen and whatever free food she could scavenge from campus events. The math of poverty was relentless. Every dollar spent on food was a dollar not going toward rent. Every hour spent at a catering job was an hour not spent in her studio, not working on the portfolio that was supposed to be her ticket to something better. But portfolios didn't pay bills, and dreams didn't fill empty stomachs. Champagne? Lena offered her tray to a cluster of women dripping in diamonds, their laughter sharp and bright as broken glass. One of them took a flute without looking at Lena's face, without acknowledging her existence at all. It was a particular skill of the wealthy, Lena had noticed. The ability to accept service while rendering the server invisible. She'd grown up middle class in a Pennsylvania suburb, the daughter of a high school teacher and a nurse. Comfortable enough, but nothing like this. Nothing that prepared her for the way New York City could swallow you whole if you didn't have money as armor. Her parents had been so proud when she got into the prestigious art program, had believed so completely in her talent. They'd helped as much as they could, but they were stretched thin themselves now, facing their own financial pressures as they approached retirement. Lena wouldn't ask them for more. Couldn't. This was her dream, her choice to pursue art in the most expensive city in America. If she couldn't make it work, that was on her. The room swayed again, and Lena steadied herself against a nearby column, the marble cool beneath her palm. When had she eaten last? Really eaten, not just coffee and the stale bagel someone had left in the catering break room. Yesterday morning? The day before? Time had started blurring together lately, measured in shifts and deadlines and the constant grinding anxiety of not having enough. Miss? Are you supposed to be standing there? Lena jerked upright to find a severe woman in an event coordinator's headset glaring at her with undisguised irritation. The North Terrace needs service. Why are you hovering? I'm sorry, I was just... Move. Now. Lena moved, threading back through the crowd with her tray held high, the champagne glasses trembling slightly with the tremor in her hands. The North Terrace. She could make it to the North Terrace. Just a little longer, and then the event would be over, and she could collect her cash and take the subway home and sleep for 12 hours straight. The crowd seemed to press in closer now, the noise of conversation rising to a dull roar in her ears. Lena's vision darkened at the edges, then cleared, then darkened again. Her heart was racing, but her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. She knew these symptoms, her body running on fumes, pushing past limits that shouldn't be pushed. But what choice did she have? There was no safety net, no family wealth to fall back on, no trust fund waiting in the wings. There was only forward, only the next step, only the desperate math of survival. She was 3 yards from the terrace doors when her knee buckled. The tray tilted, champagne glasses sliding, and Lena tried to catch herself, but her legs had stopped obeying commands. The floor rushed up to meet her, the marble hard and unforgiving, and she had just enough time to think, "This is going to hurt," before arms caught her. Strong arms, expensive fabric, the scent of cedar, and something darker. Lena's tray clattered to the floor, champagne and shattered crystal scattering across marble, but she didn't fall. Someone had caught her mid-collapse, was holding her with a steadiness that felt surreal against the chaos of her failing body. "I've got you." The voice was low, controlled, edged with something that might have been concern, but felt more like command. "Don't try to stand." Lena's vision swam, the ballroom kaleidoscoping into fragments of light and shadow. She was aware of the sudden silence that had fallen over the nearby crowd, aware of whispers rising like smoke, but she couldn't make sense of any of it. Her mind felt stuffed with cotton, her thoughts moving through molasses. "Someone call for medical assistance. Now." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. Lena felt herself being shifted, gathered more securely against a broad chest, and some distant part of her brain registered that she should probably be embarrassed, should be apologizing for the disruption, for the broken glasses, for existing too visibly in a space where she was supposed to be invisible. But she was so tired, so impossibly, bone-deep tired. "Stay with me." The command was gentler now, a hand cupping the back of her head with surprising care. "Keep your eyes open. Look at me." Lena tried. She managed to focus on the face above hers, strong jaw, dark eyes that seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed defenses, a mouth set in a line of intense concentration. Handsome, she registered dimly, dangerously handsome, in a way that had nothing to do with symmetry and everything to do with the raw presence he commanded. "What's your name?" The question came from far away, but Lena found herself answering automatically. "Lena. Lena Hart." "When did you last eat, Lena?" She blinked slowly, trying to remember. Yesterday? Maybe." Something flickered across his expression. Anger, she thought, but not directed at her. "Yesterday." It wasn't a question. He turned his head slightly, addressing someone Lena couldn't see. "Where the hell is the medic?" "Sir, they're coming, but perhaps we should—" "I'm not putting her down until someone competent examines her." The absurdity of the situation was starting to penetrate through Lena's fog. She was being held in the arms of a stranger in the middle of a Manhattan gala, having just destroyed an entire tray of expensive champagne, and he was refusing to let her go. This wasn't how these events were supposed to proceed. Staff didn't collapse, guests didn't catch them, and people definitely didn't speak with the kind of authority that made a room full of New York's elite fall silent and attentive. "I'm okay," Lena managed, though her voice came out thread and weak. I should get back to work. I'm so sorry about the glasses. You're not going anywhere." The man holding her shifted his grip slightly, one arm more securely beneath her knees, the other supporting her shoulders. "And you're sure as hell not apologizing for passing out from hunger." The bluntness of his words, the accuracy of his assessment, made heat flood Lena's face despite her exhaustion. She wasn't used to being seen this clearly, having her circumstances laid bare without euphemism or polite fiction. A woman in a medic's uniform appeared at his elbow, professional and efficient. "Sir, if you could lay her down, here's fine." He didn't move, didn't relinquish his hold on Lena. "Check her out, thoroughly." The medic's eyes flickered with something, surprise, respect, fear. But she immediately began her assessment, checking Lena's pulse, her eyes, asking questions about medical history and symptoms, while Lena answered as best she could through the fog still clouding her thoughts. "Blood pressure's low, pulse is weak, classic signs of malnutrition and dehydration. The medic's voice was carefully neutral, but Lena caught the edge of professional concern. She needs fluids, food, and rest. I'd recommend taking her to the ER for a full workup. No! Lena tried to sit up, panic cutting through exhaustion. No, I can't afford. I don't have insurance that covers emergency room visits. I just need. You need medical attention. The man's voice cut through her protest with absolute finality. Cost is irrelevant. Cost is not irrelevant, Lena argued, frustration giving her a burst of energy. Cost is everything. I can't just. Who are you, anyway? Why do you even care? He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges of all that controlled intensity. Marco, he said simply. Marco DeLuca. And right now, I care because you're in my arms and you can barely hold your head up. Everything else can wait. DeLuca. The name echoed through Lena's foggy awareness, carrying weight she couldn't quite place. Around them, the crowd had begun to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones, but there was still a circle of space around them, as if people were afraid to get too close. Mr. DeLuca, if we could just... The event coordinator had reappeared, her earlier irritation replaced by obsequious concern. I apologize for the disruption. We'll handle our staff member's situation and ensure everything is cleaned up immediately. Your staff member has a name. Marco's voice dropped to a temperature that made the coordinator take an involuntary step back. And she's being handled by me. Make sure there's a car waiting at the east entrance, immediately. Of course, sir. Right away. The coordinator fled, speaking urgently into her headset, and Marco finally moved, carrying Lena toward the ballroom's side exit with the kind of easy strength that suggested her weight was nothing to him. The medic followed, still monitoring Lena with professional efficiency, though she seemed distinctly nervous about contradicting anything Marco said. I really can walk, Lena protested weakly. This is insane. You don't just carry around people you don't know. I do tonight. Marco navigated through a service corridor away from the main event. And you can walk when you've got food in your stomach and color back in your face. Until then, stop arguing. Stop arguing. You can't just... I can. He glanced down at her, and for the first time there was a hint of dark humor in his expression. And I am. Get used to it. They emerged into a private corridor, thick carpet muffling footsteps, artwork on the walls that Lena's trained eye immediately recognized as original and worth more than her entire education. A sleek black car was already waiting at a discreet side entrance, a driver holding the door open with professional impassivity. Marco settled Lena into the back seat with unexpected gentleness, then turned to the medic. I need a doctor at my penthouse within the hour. Full concierge service, complete discretion. Have them bring IV fluids and whatever else they'll need for malnutrition treatment. Sir, I really think the emergency room, I think you'll do what I'm paying you to do. Marco's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Unless you'd like to explain to your supervisor why you refused a patient transport. The medic swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, sir. I'll make the arrangements. She disappeared back into the hotel, and Marco slid into the car beside Lena, leaving a careful distance between them despite the intimacy of having just carried her through a crowded ballroom. He pulled off his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Lena hadn't realized she was shivering before speaking to the driver. Home, fast but smooth. The car pulled away from the hotel with barely a whisper of engine noise, and Lena found herself cocooned in leather seats and the lingering warmth of Marco's jacket, still trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't real. This didn't happen to people like her. Wealthy strangers didn't swoop in and rescue struggling art students. That was fiction, fantasy, the kind of story she might sketch out in her studio during late-night sessions when reality felt too heavy to bear. This is crazy, she said aloud, to herself as much as to Marco. I don't even know you. You don't know me. You can't just take me to your penthouse. That's not how any of this works. How does it work then? Marco asked, his tone genuinely curious. You collapse from hunger at a gala, get fired by people who worked you to the point of collapse, and then what? Take yourself to an emergency room you can't afford? Go home to an empty apartment and hope you don't pass out again? The accuracy of his scenario, the bleakness of what her night would actually have been, made Lena's throat tight. That's not your problem to solve. Maybe not. Marco turned to look at her fully, and in the passing streetlights, his face was all sharp angles and shadows. But it's mine to solve tonight. Tomorrow, you can go back to your life, make your own choices. Tonight, you're going to eat a proper meal, see a doctor, and sleep somewhere safe. That's not negotiable. Why? The question burst out of Lena with more force than she intended. Why do you care? You don't know anything about me. Marco was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an intensity that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Because when you were falling, and I caught you, you looked up at me with these eyes that were trying so hard to be strong while your whole body was giving up. And something in me, he paused as if searching for words he wasn't used to needing. Something recognized that look, that fight. I don't know you, Lena Hart, but I know what it's like to be running on empty and still trying to stand. And I know what it means when someone catches you before you hit the ground. The vulnerability in his words, unexpected and raw, made Lena's breath catch. This wasn't a wealthy man playing savior. This was something more complicated, more personal, something that scared her almost as much as it drew her in. I don't need saving, she said quietly. Good. Marco's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm not particularly good at it anyway, but I'm excellent at providing resources. Think of this as practical assistance. Practical assistance from a stranger who commands rooms full of people with a single word and has doctors making house calls to his penthouse. Lena shook her head, exhaustion and surrealism blending into something almost like laughter. This is the weirdest night of my entire life. It's about to get weirder, Marco said, and this time there was definitely humor in his voice. Wait until you meet my chef. He's going to lose his mind trying to figure out what to make for someone who hasn't eaten in 2 days. Fair warning, he's deeply, personally offended by empty stomachs. Despite everything, the strangeness, the fear, the sheer impossibility of her situation, Lena felt a smile tug at her lips. Your chef, Pietro. He came with the penthouse. I tried to fire him 3 times before I realized he's actually invaluable. Marco settled back against the seat, somehow managing to look completely relaxed in a way that Lena suspected was carefully cultivated. He's going to take one look at you and start muttering in Italian about young people and modern diets and the decline of civilization. I'm not usually this thin, Lena found herself defending. It's been a hard semester, expensive, and the jobs don't pay enough, and the loans don't cover enough, and there are only so many hours in a day to make up the difference. Art school? Lena nodded. Painting, primarily. Some mixed media. I'm in my final year at Ashworth Academy. Marco's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a serious program. Competitive. Yeah. Lena pulled his jacket more tightly around her shoulders, letting herself sink into the warmth. I got lucky with scholarships, but lucky doesn't cover rent in Manhattan, or art supplies, or any of the 1,000 other things that cost money. So I work catering gigs and cafe shifts and whatever else I can find, and I paint when there's time left over, which there never really is. What do you paint? The question was casual, conversational, but something about the way Marco asked it, with genuine interest rather than polite small talk, made Lena actually think about her answer. Moments, she said slowly. In-between moments. The space between what was and what's coming. Transition. Transformation. The way light looks when it's starting to change but hasn't fully shifted yet. She paused, suddenly self-conscious. That probably sounds pretentious. It sounds specific, Marco corrected. Specific is good. Specific means you know what you're doing. I know what I'm trying to do, Lena amended. Actually doing it is harder. There's this gap between the vision in my head and what ends up on the canvas, and I spend most of my time trying to bridge that gap while also working 40 hours a week at jobs that have nothing to do with art and everything to do with not being homeless. The car turned onto a street Lena recognized, Central Park West, where buildings had names instead of numbers and doormen who earned more than she did. Her stomach twisted with a new kind of anxiety. This was so far outside her world it might as well be another planet. This is where you live? Home is where the property taxes are obscene, Marco said dryly. Try not to be too impressed. It's just a place. But it wasn't just a place, and they both knew it. The car pulled into a private underground garage, security immediately moving to open doors, and Marco was out and around to Lena's side before she could even unfasten her seatbelt. He held out a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, letting him help her out of the car. Her legs were steadier now, but still weak, and Marco kept a careful hand at her elbow as they moved toward a private elevator that required a key card to operate. The whole setup screamed security, privacy, the kind of heat of careful protection that came with either extreme wealth or extreme danger. Or both. "You're sure about this?" Lena asked as the elevator doors closed, sealing them into a space that suddenly felt very intimate. "I'm literally a stranger who broke your champagne glasses. You could just drop me at a diner with $20 and call it charity." Marco looked at her, really looked at her, and Lena felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "I'm not sure about much," he admitted, "but I'm sure that watching you try to stand while your body was shutting down, seeing you apologize for being hungry, that did something to me. Made me angry. Made me want to fix it. And I'm a man who's used to fixing things when they need fixing." "I'm not a thing," Lena said quietly. "No." Marco's voice was soft but absolute. "You're not. You're a person who needed help tonight, and I was there to provide it. That's all this has to be if that's all you want. Food, medical attention, a safe place to sleep, and tomorrow you walk away. No strings, no obligations, no expectations." The elevator opened directly into a penthouse that was somehow both exactly what Lena expected and nothing like she'd imagined. Clean lines, expensive but not ostentatious, art on the walls that she immediately recognized as museum quality. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Central Park, the city spreading below like a carpet of lights. "Madonna!" a voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the apartment, Italian accent thick with emotion. "He brings home a girl who looks like a strong wind would blow her away. Marco, what have you done?" A small, round man with a magnificent mustache and an apron dusted with flour came bustling into the foyer, hands gesturing expressively. His eyes landed on Lena, and his expression transformed from irritation to instant concern. "Dio mio, she's half-starved. Marco, explain yourself. Who is this angel, and why does she look like she hasn't had a proper meal in months?" "Pietro, this is Lena," Marco said, his tone suggesting this was a familiar routine. "Lena, this is Pietro, who you'll notice has no concept of personal boundaries or appropriate questions." "Appropriate questions," Pietro huffed. "I'll tell you what's appropriate. Food. Immediately. Sit, bellissima. You sit right here and Pietro will fix everything." He was already guiding Lena toward a kitchen that was larger than her entire apartment, settling her onto a stool at a massive island, muttering in Italian about modern youth and starvation diets, and the general tragedy of empty stomachs. Despite her exhaustion, despite the surreal quality of her entire evening, Lena found herself smiling. "He's very passionate about food," Marco said, leaning against the counter beside her with casual grace. "I'm passionate about not letting beautiful young women faint from hunger," Pietro corrected, already assembling ingredients with practiced efficiency. "You, Marco, should be ashamed. Where did you find her? How long has she been like this?" "Never mind, don't answer. Pietro can see everything he needs to see." He began cooking with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for surgery, and the kitchen filled with the scent of garlic and herbs and something rich and savory that made Lena's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. "Start with broth," Marco instructed. "Her system can't handle heavy food right away." "You think Pietro doesn't know this?" But the chef was already ladling something into a bowl, setting it in front of Lena with unexpected gentleness. "Drink slowly, cara. Small sips. We'll work up to the real food." The broth was perfect, rich, flavorful, warming, and Lena forced herself to follow instructions, taking small sips even though every cell in her body wanted to gulp it down. Pietro watched with approval, nodding to himself as color slowly began to return to her cheeks. The doorbell rang, a soft chime, and Marco moved to answer it, returning moments later with a woman carrying a medical bag. She was younger than Lena expected, professional and kind-eyed. "Dr. Chen," she introduced herself, setting down her bag. "Mr. DeLuca called about a patient needing assessment and treatment." For the next 30 minutes, Dr. Chen conducted a thorough examination while Pietro continued cooking and Marco watched from nearby, his expression unreadable. The doctor confirmed what they all already knew: severe dehydration, malnutrition, dangerous levels of stress, and exhaustion. "I'd like to start an IV," Dr. Chen said. "Get some fluids in you properly. You're not at critical levels, but you're close enough that I'd rather be cautious." Lena wanted to protest, but she was too tired, and the broth had settled warmly in her stomach, making her realize just how close she'd come to a complete physical breakdown. So she nodded, let the doctor set up the IV in her arm, felt the cool flow of fluids beginning to rehydrate her starved system. Pietro presented a plate of delicate pasta, perfectly portioned for someone whose stomach had been empty too long. Lena ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about the cost of all this care, the debt she was accumulating with every moment in Marco's penthouse. "Stop calculating," Marco said quietly, somehow reading her thoughts. "There is no bill. There is no debt. Tonight is exactly what I said it was: practical assistance." "Nobody does this without wanting something," Lena said, too exhausted to be anything but honest. "Most people don't." Marco's dark eyes held hers. "I'm not most people." "That's what I'm afraid of," Lena admitted. Marco smiled, really smiled this time, and it transformed his entire face. "Good instincts, but not good enough to stop you from being here, which means some part of you trusts me. Or at least trusts that whatever I am, I'm not an immediate threat. That's a pretty low bar for trust." "It's a start." Marco straightened. "Finish eating. Dr. Chen will monitor you for another hour while the IV finishes. Then you're going to sleep. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." "I have class tomorrow," Lena said automatically. "You have rest tomorrow," Marco corrected. "Class can wait 24 hours. Your body can't." He was right, and Lena knew it, but the anxiety of falling behind, of losing even a day, made her chest tight. "I can't afford—" "Stop." Marco's voice was gentle but firm. "For tonight, just stop. Stop calculating. Stop worrying about cost. Stop trying to figure out what the catch is. Just eat, rest, and let yourself be taken care of. One night. That's all I'm asking." Lena looked at him, this stranger who had caught her before she fell, who had brought her to his home, who was offering her care without expectation, and made a decision that was probably stupid but felt, in that moment, necessary. "Okay," she whispered. "One night." Marco's expression softened with something that might have been relief. "One night," he agreed. And as Pietro continued to fuss, and Dr. Chen monitored her vitals, and the city glittered outside floor-to-ceiling windows, Lena Hart let herself be caught, be held, be helped, and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that the first person to truly see her falling was a man whose dark eyes held secrets she didn't know how to read. Lena woke to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't recognize, wrapped in sheets that felt like clouds against her skin. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place where she was. The ceiling was too high, the bed too soft, the silence too complete. Then memory flooded back in fragments: the gala, the fall, Marco's arms catching her, the warmth of his penthouse, and Pietro's insistent feeding. She sat up slowly, testing her body's responses. The IV was gone, her arm bandaged neatly where the needle had been. Someone had left her clothes folded on a chair. Not her catering uniform, but soft cotton pajamas that were clearly expensive and several sizes too large. A note rested on top in bold, masculine handwriting. "Your uniform is being cleaned. These will do until Pietro finishes breakfast. Don't even think about leaving without eating. M." The presumption should have annoyed her. Instead, Lena found herself smiling as she pulled on the oversized pajamas and padded barefoot out of the bedroom. The penthouse looked different in daylight, less intimidating, more lived in. Books stacked on end tables, a laptop left open on the dining table, art that clearly meant something personal rather than just expensive decoration. She followed the sound of voices and the scent of coffee to the kitchen, where Pietro was already in full operation mode, and Marco sat at the island reading something on his phone, dressed casually in dark jeans and a Henley that somehow made him look more dangerous than the tuxedo had. "She lives," Pietro announced dramatically. "And look, Marco, she has color in her face like a human person instead of a ghost." "Good morning," Marco said, his dark eyes assessing her with the same careful attention he'd shown the night before. How do you feel? Like I slept for 1,000 years, Lena admitted, sliding onto a stool. What time is it? Almost 11. Marco poured her a cup of coffee without asking, prepared it with cream and sugar as if he somehow knew how she took it. Dr. Chen came back this morning to check on you. You were sleeping so deeply she didn't want to wake you, but she said everything looks better. Your hydration levels are improving. Lena accepted the coffee, trying not to think about how Marco had apparently watched her sleep long enough to notice she was deeply unconscious. She came back? You're paying her to make house calls twice? I'm paying her to make sure you're recovering properly, Marco corrected. Money I have. Medical training I don't. Therefore, I employ people who do. The logic of the wealthy, Lena murmured, but there was no real bite in it. The logic of someone who doesn't take chances with people's health. Marco's tone was mild, but there was steel underneath. Eat what Pietro makes you. All of it. Your body needs to remember what proper nutrition feels like. Pietro was already setting down a plate. Scrambled eggs with herbs, perfectly toasted bread, fresh fruit arranged artfully. Lena's stomach growled audibly, and both men smiled. Your stomach at least has good sense, Pietro said with satisfaction. Even if the rest of you doesn't know how to take care of itself properly. I know how, Lena said quietly, picking up her fork. I just haven't had the resources to do it right. The words hung in the air, honest and stark, and Marco's expression shifted into something harder to read. He watched her take her first bite, waited until she'd eaten several more before speaking again. Tell me about your art. The subject change was deliberate, giving her space to eat without the weight of her circumstances pressing down. Lena found herself grateful for it, even as she tried to figure out how to explain what she created to someone who lived in a world of museum-quality pieces. I work mostly in oils, she began, but I've been experimenting with mixed media lately, incorporating found objects, newspaper, sometimes fabric. I'm interested in layers, both literal and metaphorical, the way things build on each other, the way history seeps through even when you try to cover it. Like palimpsest, Marco said, surprising her with the reference. Exactly like palimpsest. Lena set down her fork, animated now despite her exhaustion. You can paint over something, but traces always remain. Light shows through. Texture reveals itself. I try to make that visible, intentional, the past informing the present even when we pretend it doesn't. Do you have a portfolio, digital or physical? Both. My phone's in my bag, wherever that ended up. Lena glanced around the kitchen as if her belongings might materialize. Hall closet, Marco supplied. I'll get it. He disappeared and Pietro immediately leaned in conspiratorially. He's interested, you know. Marco doesn't ask about art unless he's genuinely interested. Usually he just nods politely and writes a check. Interested in the art or interested in me? Lena asked before she could stop herself. Pietro's mustache twitched with amusement. Is there a difference, Cara? You are your art. Your art is you. This is what makes it valuable. Marco returned with her battered canvas bag, setting it gently on the counter. Lena pulled out her phone, cracked screen, 2 generations old but functional, and navigated to her digital portfolio while trying not to feel self-conscious about showing her work to someone who clearly had the resources to own anything he wanted. She handed the phone to Marco and watched his face as he scrolled through images of her paintings. His expression gave nothing away, but he took his time, studying each piece carefully before moving to the next. The silence stretched, and Lena forced herself to keep eating even though her stomach had knotted with anxiety. These are remarkable, Marco said finally, looking up at her with something like surprise in his dark eyes. You're not just talented, you're genuinely skilled. There's technical mastery here alongside the vision. Thank you, Lena managed, not trusting herself to say more. Where are these now? In your studio? Storage? Some in my apartment. It doubles as my studio, all 800 square feet of it. Some in the school's senior exhibition space. A few I sold to help cover rent, but those were earlier pieces. Not my best work. Marco continued scrolling, stopped on an image of a canvas Lena had titled Between Breaths. It showed a figure suspended in space, surrounded by fragments of previous selves, ghostly layers that both constrained and supported the central form. This one, Marco said. Is it available? It's in the senior show at Ashworth. On display, but not for sale yet. The exhibition opens in 3 weeks. I want it. Marco's tone was decisive, final. And I want to see the rest of your work. The physical pieces, not just photographs. Lena stared at him. You want to come to my apartment? My incredibly tiny, barely heated fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Washington Heights? I want to see your work in the space where you create it, Marco corrected. Context matters. You know that. You just explained how history and environment inform everything you make. That's different. That's conceptual. This is just poverty. The word came out harsher than Lena intended, but she was too tired to soften it. No. Marco's voice was quiet but absolute. This is where you make art despite poverty. There's a significant difference. One is circumstance. The other is choice and persistence, and the kind of determination that interests me very much. Pietro, who had been quietly listening while preparing more food, made a small sound of approval. He's right, Bella. Where you come from matters less than what you make of it. Easy to say when you're standing in a Central Park West penthouse, Lena muttered. You think I started here? Marco's laugh held no humor. You think I was born with marble countertops and private doctors? I grew up in Red Hook, Brooklyn, in a 2-bedroom apartment with 7 people and roaches that paid more rent than we could afford. I know exactly what poverty looks like, Lena. I know what it feels like to be hungry, to be invisible, to work yourself to exhaustion and still come up short. The rawness in his words, the sudden glimpse of something beneath the controlled exterior, made Lena look at him more carefully. She'd assumed wealth, assumed privilege, assumed the kind of background that came with penthouses and private doctors. But there was truth in Marco's voice, history in his eyes that spoke of distances traveled. How did you get from there to here? She asked quietly. That's a long story. Marco's expression shifted, closing off slightly, and one that's not particularly relevant right now. The point is, I'm not judging your circumstances. I'm interested in your work despite them. Or maybe because of them. Art that comes from struggle tends to have more truth in it. Not always, Lena argued, falling back into familiar academic territory. Some of the greatest art came from artists who had nothing but time and resources. Comfort can produce brilliance too. But not your kind of brilliance. Marco held up her phone, the image of between breaths still displayed. This doesn't come from comfort. This comes from knowing what it's like to be caught between who you were and who you're becoming. From understanding suspension, transformation, the weight of history you're trying to shed while still being shaped by it. The accuracy of his reading, the way he'd seen straight through to the core of what she'd been trying to express, made Lena's chest tight. You know about art. I know about people, Marco corrected. Art just makes people visible in ways they can't hide, and yours makes you very visible, Lena Hart. The way he said her name, with careful attention to each syllable, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. There was intensity in Marco's attention that was both thrilling and terrifying, the sense that once he focused on something, he didn't look away until he understood it completely. I should go home, Lena said, suddenly needing distance from the weight of his regard. I've imposed enough. You've been incredibly kind, but I have responsibilities, and I can't just— Your responsibilities will still be there this afternoon, Marco interrupted. But first, there's something else we need to address. He pulled out his phone, tapped something, then turned it toward her. On the screen was a bank transfer confirmation to Lena Hart for $50,000. Lena's vision actually grayed at the edges. What is that? What did you do? I bought between breaths, Marco said calmly. That's the purchase price. That painting isn't worth $50,000. Lena's voice came out too loud, edged with panic. It's a student work. I've never sold anything for more than a few hundred. You can't just— I can, and I did. Marco's tone was maddeningly reasonable. That painting is worth whatever someone is willing to pay for it. I'm willing to pay $50,000. Therefore, that's its value. This is charity, Lena said, her voice shaking. This is you feeling sorry for the starving art student and trying to throw money at the problem. I don't want charity, Marco. I don't need— It's not charity if I'm getting something I want in exchange. Marco leaned forward, his intensity suddenly sharp and focused. I want that painting, Lena. I wanted it the moment I saw it on your phone. The price reflects its worth to me, not some arbitrary market value decided by galleries and critics who wouldn't recognize real talent if it fell on them. $50,000 could change my life, Lena whispered. Yes, Marco agreed simply. So let it. Why? The question burst out of her, raw and desperate. Why are you doing this? You caught me when I fell, fine. You made sure I was fed and had medical care, okay? But this? This is something else entirely. This is life-changing money, and I don't understand what you want from me in return. Marco was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and absolutely sincere. I caught you when you fell because some instinct in me wouldn't let you hit the ground. I brought you here because I wanted to make sure you were safe. And I'm buying your art because it deserves to be bought, because you deserve to be valued, and because watching you try to argue your way out of being helped is making me understand just how long you've been doing this alone. I'm fine alone, Lena said automatically. No, you're not. You're surviving alone. There's a difference. Marco's jaw tightened. And before you tell me again that you don't need saving, I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to give you room to breathe, space to create without constantly calculating whether you can afford to eat. That's not rescue. That's just removing obstacles. By throwing money at them. I have money to throw. Marco shrugged. And you have talent that's being suffocated by poverty. This seems like a reasonable exchange to me. Pietro, who had been uncharacteristically silent, set down a fresh cup of coffee in front of Lena. The boy makes sense, even if he's terrible at explaining himself. Accept the money, Cara. Make your art. Let someone appreciate what you create. This is not charity. This is patronage. Very old tradition. Very respectable. Patronage comes with expectations, Lena countered. Obligations. Only if you let it. Marco stood, came around the island until he was close enough that Lena had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I'm going to say this once, as clearly as I can. I want nothing from you except the painting I've already purchased. No obligations, no strings, no expectations of anything beyond what you choose to give freely. You can take the money, go back to your life, and never speak to me again. That's completely within your rights. But, Lena prompted because there was clearly more. Marco's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. But I'm also going to offer you my card and tell you that if you need anything at all, you can call me. Not because you owe me, not because I expect something in return, but because sometimes it's easier to survive when you know someone's in your corner. He pulled out a business card, set it on the counter between them. Heavy cardstock, minimal design, just a name and number. Marco De Luca. No company, no title, nothing to indicate what he actually did for a living. What do you do? Lena asked, touching the card but not picking it up. For work, I mean. How did you get from Red Hook to Central Park West? Import and export, Marco said after a slight pause. Various business interests, investments, the kind of work that's easier to show than explain. It was a non-answer, and they both knew it, but there was a warning in Marco's tone, a boundary being drawn, and Lena found herself respecting it even as curiosity gnawed at her. Import and export, she repeated. That covers a lot of territory. It does. Marco's expression gave nothing away. Let's just say I'm good at moving things from one place to another and making sure the right people get what they need. The phrasing was careful, almost deliberately vague, and Lena felt the first real prickle of unease since waking up. She'd been so focused on Marco's unexpected kindness, his generosity, his interest in her art, that she hadn't stopped to question what kind of man had the resources to command private doctors and buy paintings for $50,000 on impulse. You're scared now, Marco observed, his voice softening. Good. You should have been scared last night, honestly. Coming home with a stranger, no matter how good his intentions seemed. Are you trying to frighten me? Lena asked, holding her ground despite her racing heart. I'm trying to be honest with you. Marco stepped back, giving her space. My life is complicated, Lena. The way I make money isn't always conventional. But I've never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it, and I've never lied about who I am to anyone who asked directly. So if I ask directly who you are, you'll tell me? I'll tell you that I'm a man who grew up with nothing. and built something substantial through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness when necessary, and knowing when to help people who needed helping. Marco's dark eyes held hers steadily. I'll tell you that I've done things I'm not proud of, and things I'd do again without hesitation. I'll tell you that people fear me for good reason, respect me for better ones, and that very few people see me the way you saw me last night, as someone who could be kind without calculation. But you were calculating, Lena said slowly, pieces falling into place. You saw an opportunity. A transaction. No. Marco's voice went hard. I saw someone falling and caught them. Everything after that was instinct, not strategy. If I'd been calculating, I would have let you fall, made sure you were handed off to medical professionals, and written a check to the catering company to cover any liability. What I did instead was bring you to my home, feed you, stay up half the night making sure you were stable, and buy your art this morning because I wanted to give you options I knew you didn't have. The rawness in his words, the frustration bleeding through his controlled exterior, made Lena pause. Whatever Marco DeLuca was, businessman, criminal, something in between, he'd been genuine in his concern for her. Of that, she was certain. I'm still scared, she admitted. Good, Marco said again. Fear means you're paying attention, but let me be very clear about one thing, Lena. Whatever I am, whatever I've done, whatever business interests I have that might exist in moral gray areas, I would never, ever hurt you. That's not a line I cross. Women, children, innocent people just trying to survive? They're off limits. Always have been. Always will be. That's supposed to be reassuring? It's supposed to be honest. Marco picked up her phone from the counter, handed it back to her. The money's in your account. It'll clear by this afternoon. Use it however you want. Pay your rent, your loans, stock up on art supplies, whatever you need. The painting will stay in the senior show until the exhibition ends, then I'll arrange to have it delivered here. And if you never want to see me again after you walk out that door, I'll respect that completely. Lena stood, Pietro's delicious breakfast settling warm in her stomach, $50,000 suddenly real in her bank account, and a dangerous man offering her freedom from the grinding poverty that had been slowly crushing her for 3 years. It should have been an easy decision. Take the money and run. Disappear back into her own life. Forget that Marco DeLuca existed. But she couldn't stop seeing the way he'd looked at her when she was falling, the care in his hands when he'd carried her to the car, the absolute conviction in his voice when he told her she deserved to be valued. She couldn't forget that in a room full of wealthy people who had looked straight through her, Marco had been the only one to actually see her. I want to show you my studio, Lena heard herself say, the rest of my work, but on my terms, in my space. If you're really interested in my art and not just trying to rescue me, then you can see where it comes from. Something flickered in Marco's expression. Surprise, pleasure, satisfaction, maybe all three. When? This afternoon. Give me time to go home, clean up, make sure the place doesn't look like a complete disaster. Lena pulled her phone closer, protective. And Marco? If I'm letting you into my space, into my work, then I need you to be straight with me. No more vague answers about import-export. If there's danger in knowing you, if there's risk in taking your money, I need to understand what I'm walking into. Marco studied her for a long moment, and Lena could see him weighing options, calculating risks, deciding how much truth she could handle. My father ran the Brooklyn docks for 20 years, he said finally. When he died, I inherited his network, his connections, and his reputation. I've built on that foundation, expanded it, made it legitimate where I could, kept it functional where I couldn't. I work with people who operate outside traditional systems because sometimes traditional systems don't serve the people who need them most. I move money, goods, information, and sometimes people from places they're trapped to places they can breathe. Is all of it legal? No. Is any of it unconscionable? Not by my definition. Your definition being? That anyone I help is someone who couldn't get help through legal channels. That anyone I move against is someone who's caused real harm. That the money I make goes toward building something better than what I inherited. Marco's jaw tightened. I'm not a saint, Lena, but I'm not a monster either. I'm just someone who learned early that the system doesn't work for people like us, so I built something outside it that does. The honesty was stark, uncomfortable, and probably more than Lena had any right to ask for, but it gave her something to hold on to. Not reassurance exactly, but clarity, Marco DeLuca was dangerous, but in specific ways to specific people, and she apparently wasn't one of them. Okay, Lena said quietly. My address is 342 West 187th Street, apartment 4B. Come by around 3. And Marco? Come alone. Not with security, not with assistance, just you. Just me, Marco agreed. Pietro, who had been listening to the entire exchange with unabashed interest, clapped his hands together. Finally, some honesty. This is progress. And you, Bella, you eat more before you go. Take food with you. Pietro insists. He was already packing containers with leftovers, enough to feed Lena for days, and she didn't have the energy to protest. Marco walked her to the elevator when she was ready to leave, her own clothes cleaned and returned, her bag packed with food, and her cracked screen phone heavy with impossible money. 3 o'clock, Marco confirmed as the elevator doors began to close. Your space, your terms, I'll see where the art comes from. And I'll decide if I trust you, Lena countered. Marco's smile was sharp and honest. Fair enough. The elevator descended and Lena watched the numbers count down, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 18 hours. She'd collapsed at a gala, been caught by a dangerous man, slept in a Central Park penthouse, and woken up with $50,000 she hadn't earned. None of it made sense. All of it felt both too good to be true and somehow exactly right. Her phone buzzed as she stepped out into the lobby. A text from an unknown number that had to be Marco. Pietro sends his love and says if you don't eat everything he packed, he'll take it personally. Also, for what it's worth, I'm glad I caught you. And Lena found herself smiling despite the confusion, despite the fear, despite every reasonable instinct that said she should run far and fast from Marco DeLuca and his complicated life. Instead, she texted back, "See you at 3," and stepped out into the cold January morning, $50,000 richer, fed for the first time in days, and walking toward an afternoon that would either confirm her instincts or prove that sometimes the person who catches you when you're falling might just be worth the risk of trusting. The subway ride back to Washington Heights gave Lena time to think, though thinking only made everything more complicated. She sat with Pietro's food containers balanced on her lap, her phone heavy in her pocket with its impossible bank balance, and tried to make sense of a world that had shifted on its axis in less than 24 hours. $50,000. The number kept circling through her mind like a prayer or a curse. She couldn't decide which. It was more money than her parents made in a year combined, more than her entire student loan debt for her final semester, more than she'd earned in the last 3 years of catering gigs and cafe shifts, and every other desperate attempt to stay afloat in a city designed to drown people without resources. And Marco had transferred it like it meant nothing, like buying a painting from a starving student for an astronomical price was just another Tuesday morning transaction. Lena's hands tightened on the food containers. She should be grateful. She was grateful, but gratitude came tangled with fear and confusion and an attraction she didn't want to acknowledge. Because Marco DeLuca was beautiful, in the way dangerous things were beautiful. All controlled power and sharp edges, and the promise of something that could either save you or destroy you, depending on how you approached it. The train lurched into her stop, and Lena climbed the stairs to street level, emerging into the familiar chaos of Washington Heights. Her neighborhood was a world away from Central Park West, bodegas instead of boutiques, fire escapes instead of doormen, the constant symphony of multiple languages blending together. This was where real New York lived, where immigrants and artists and everyone else the city hadn't managed to squeeze out yet made their stand. Her building was a pre-war walk-up that had seen better days around the time the Brooklyn Bridge opened. Lena climbed the 4 flights with practiced efficiency, juggling food containers in her bag, stepping over the loose board on the 3rd-floor landing that the landlord kept promising to fix. Her apartment door stuck in its frame like always, requiring a specific combination of key turn and shoulder push that she'd perfected over 2 years of living there. Inside, the space was exactly as she'd left it, tiny, cluttered, and unmistakably hers. 800 square feet divided between a main room that served as both studio and living area, a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, and a bathroom where the shower only worked if you jiggled the handle just right. Canvases leaned against every available wall surface, some finished, some in progress, some abandoned halfway through when she'd run out of either inspiration or supplies. The winter light coming through the single large window was perfect for painting, one of the few genuine advantages of the apartment. Lena had arranged her easel to catch the northern exposure, and her palette table sat within arm's reach, still covered with dried paint from her last session 3 days ago. Had it really only been 3 days? It felt like a lifetime. She put Pietro's food in her ancient refrigerator, which suddenly looked very empty despite the containers, and then stood in the middle of her studio, seeing it through fresh eyes. Through Marco's eyes. What would he see when he walked in here? The cramped quarters? The second-hand furniture? The gap in the floorboards where cold air whistled through? Or would he see what she saw? A space filled with work and passion and the stubborn refusal to give up on something as impractical as art? Lena spent the next 2 hours cleaning with manic focus. She organized canvases, wiped down surfaces, swept the floor, and tried to make her apartment look less like the home of someone barely surviving and more like the studio of a serious artist. The distinction was subtle but important. She wasn't trying to hide her circumstances. Marco already knew about those. She was trying to present her work in its best light, to show him that poverty didn't mean lack of professionalism or dedication. At 2:45, she changed out of her cleaning clothes into jeans and a paint-stained sweater that she'd owned since freshman year. She pulled her hair back, washed the cleaning grime off her hands, and then stood in front of her largest completed canvas, trying to center herself. The painting was titled Reconstruction, and it showed a cityscape being simultaneously demolished and rebuilt, the destruction and creation happening in the same moment, layers of past and present and future all visible at once. It was one of her strongest pieces, technically accomplished and emotionally raw, and she'd been saving it for her final thesis presentation. A knock sounded at her door at exactly 3 o'clock. Lena took a breath, steadied herself, and opened it. Marco stood in her dim hallway looking impossibly out of place in his expensive clothes and controlled presence, but his expression when he met her eyes was open, curious, and genuinely interested. He'd come alone as she'd requested. No security hovering in the background, no assistants carrying briefcases. Just him, holding a small bag from a high-end art supply store that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "I wasn't sure what you might need," he said by way of greeting, "so I asked them to put together a comprehensive selection. If it's presumptuous, I apologize." Lena took the bag, looked inside, and felt her breath catch. Oil paints in colors she'd been rationing for months, brushes she'd only seen in catalogs, canvas stretchers and gesso and medium that would last her through graduation and beyond. It was thoughtful and practical, and exactly what an artist would need, chosen by someone who'd actually paid attention to what kind of work she did. "It's perfect," she managed. "Thank you." "Can I come in?" Lena stepped back, led him into her tiny apartment, and watched his face as he took in her studio. Marco moved slowly through the space, his attention complete and focused, studying each canvas with the same careful attention he'd given her digital portfolio that morning. He didn't speak, didn't offer immediate commentary, just looked at her work with an intensity that made Lena's skin feel too tight. "You can tell me what you think," she said when the silence stretched too long. "I'm used to critique. Art school is basically 3 years of having your work torn apart." "I'm not critiquing," Marco said quietly, standing in front of Reconstruction. "I'm trying to understand how someone your age has this much depth, this much understanding of complexity and contradiction." You mean, how does someone poor understand struggle?" Lena couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "No." Marco turned to face her, his expression serious. "I mean, how does someone who's 24 years old understand that destruction and creation are the same process? That you can't build something new without demolishing what came before? That transformation requires both violence and care?" He gestured to the canvas. "This isn't just technically skilled, Lena. It's emotionally sophisticated in a way that usually takes decades to develop." The accuracy of his reading, the way he'd articulated something she'd felt but never quite put into words, made Lena's chest tight. "I've had to rebuild myself a few times," she said quietly. "You learn things when you keep having to start over." "Yes," Marco agreed. "You do." He moved to the next canvas, a smaller piece she'd titled Between Words. It showed 2 figures in conversation, but the space between them was filled with all the things left unsaid, ghostly text that suggested meaning without ever becoming clear, language that existed in the gap between intention and expression. "This is what it's like talking to you," Marco said, and there was humor in his voice. Everything you're not saying is as loud as what you are. Same could be said about you, Lena countered. You're very good at words that sound like answers but don't actually tell me anything. Fair. Marco's smile was sharp and honest. What do you want to know? Everything. Nothing. I don't know. Lena sat on her second-hand couch, suddenly exhausted. This morning you told me about your father, about the docks, about building something outside traditional systems. But that doesn't tell me who you are now, what you actually do, why people fear you. Marco was quiet for a moment, then came to sit beside her, not too close, leaving space between them, but near enough that she could feel the heat of him in her cold apartment. My father ran a union, he began, longshoremen, dock workers, the people who moved cargo in and out of Brooklyn. It was legitimate on paper, but the reality was more complicated. He provided protection, settled disputes, made sure his people got paid fairly, and worked safely. Sometimes that meant negotiating with shipping companies. Sometimes it meant negotiating with people who operated in shadows. The mob, Lena said flatly. That word covers a lot of territory and doesn't really explain much, Marco replied. But yes, my father had connections to organized families. He worked with them when it benefited his people, stood against them when it didn't. He built a reputation as someone who couldn't be bought but could be reasoned with, someone who kept his word and expected others to keep theirs. And when he died? I was 22, 3 years older than you are now. Marco's jaw tightened. The families thought they could absorb his network, fold his people into their operations. They were wrong. I held the line, kept the independence he'd built, and expanded into territory they didn't expect. I started moving money for people who needed it moved quietly, helping people immigrate when legal channels failed them, providing security for businesses in neighborhoods where the police presence was either absent or actively harmful. You became what your father was, Lena said slowly, but bigger. I became what my father would have been if he'd had more ambition and less sentiment. Marco's voice was matter of fact. I love what he built, but I'm not bound by his limitations. I saw opportunities where he saw complications, and I was willing to take risks he wouldn't have considered. Like what? Marco looked at her, assessing how much truth she could handle. Like moving into finance, helping people who've been denied traditional banking services, setting up networks that let money flow where it needs to go without government oversight or institutional gatekeeping. It's legal in the sense that I'm not breaking any laws I can't defend in court. It's illegal in the sense that I'm deliberately circumventing systems designed to keep certain people poor and powerless. Robin Hood with better lawyers, Lena said. Robin Hood with an understanding that sometimes the system itself is the problem, not individual actors within it. Marco's expression was serious. I help people, Lena. That's what I do. But I also make a significant profit doing it, and I'm not apologetic about that. The difference between me and the people I work against is that I remember where I came from. I remember what it's like to be powerless, and I use my power to give other people options they wouldn't have otherwise. Including me. Including you. Marco held her gaze. You were invisible at that gala. Not to me, but to everyone else. They looked straight through you like you didn't exist. That's what poverty does in places like Manhattan. It renders you functionally invisible to people with resources. And I thought, here's someone with genuine talent, working herself to exhaustion, being ignored by everyone who could actually help her. So I helped. By throwing money at me. By recognizing value and compensating it appropriately. Marco's voice firmed. Don't diminish what you've accomplished by calling my purchase charity. Your work is worth what I paid. More, probably, if you had proper representation and gallery connections. I just eliminated the middlemen and gave you the resources directly. Lena stood, restless, moving to her palette table and running her fingers over dried paint. It scares me, she admitted quietly. How much I want to trust you. How easy it would be to let you solve problems I've been grinding myself down trying to handle alone. That kind of dependence, that kind of debt, it's dangerous. Yes, Marco agreed. It is, which is why I'm not asking you to depend on me. I'm offering you resources with no strings attached. Use the money however you want. Keep creating. Build the career you're working toward. And if you never want to see me again after today, that's your choice. But you want to see me again, Lena said. turning to face him. Yes. Marco's honesty was stark, undefended. I want to see you again. I want to watch you work. I want to understand how you think, how you translate what you see into these layers of meaning. I want to know you, Lena, not as a project or an investment or someone I'm helping, as a person who interests me in ways I don't entirely understand. The air between them felt suddenly charged, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Lena's heart was racing, her artist's eye cataloging the way light fell across Marco's face, the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he maintained even while admitting to wanting something. I don't do relationships, she said, needing to establish boundaries before she lost the ability to think clearly. I don't have time. I don't have emotional space, and I definitely don't have experience with men who carry the kind of complications you do. I'm not asking for a relationship. Marco stood slowly, crossed to where she stood by her palette table, but stopped just outside her personal space. I'm asking for permission to be in your orbit, to see you sometimes, to take you to dinner when you have time, to maybe, if you're willing, understand what happens between the moment you conceive a painting and the moment it's finished. You want to watch me work? Lena's voice came out breathier than she intended. I want to understand your process. Marco's dark eyes held hers. I want to see transformation happening in real time. And yes, selfishly, I want to spend time with someone who sees the world the way you do, who can articulate complexity without drowning in it, who survived falling by learning how to paint the descent. The poetry in his words, unexpected and genuine, made something in Lena's chest crack open. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of attraction that could derail everything she'd worked for, distract her from her goals, complicate her life in ways she couldn't afford. She should say no, should thank him for the money and the art supplies and his interest, but draw a firm line between business and personal. Instead, she heard herself say, I'm working on a new series, 5 canvases, all interconnected, exploring the concept of witness, being seen versus being observed. The difference between visibility and exposure. I usually work alone, but if you're serious about wanting to understand the process, you could come by sometimes while I'm painting. No expectations, no pressure, just presence. Marco's expression shifted, something fierce and pleased moving through his carefully controlled features. I would like that very much. There are rules, Lena continued, needing to maintain some sense of control. When I'm working, I don't stop for conversation. You can watch, but you don't interrupt. If I ask you to leave, you leave immediately. No questions. And you can't... She paused, searching for words. You can't try to influence the work. I need to know it's mine, that my vision isn't being shaped by your presence, or your money, or your expectations. Understood. Marco pulled out his phone, handed it to her. Put in your number. I'll text you before I come by. Make sure it's a good time. And Lena, I promise you I have no interest in influencing your work. What you create is yours. I just want to witness it happening. Lena took his phone, entered her contact information, and handed it back. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and the simple touch sent electricity up her arm. She pulled back quickly, but not before she saw recognition flicker in Marco's eyes. He'd felt it too. I should go, he said quietly. Let you process today. But before I do, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a card different from the one he'd given her that morning. This one had an address embossed in simple text. This is my private gallery. Actually private, not open to the public. I collect pieces that speak to me personally, rather than for investment purposes. Next week, there's a showing of a contemporary artist whose work I think you'd appreciate. If you're interested, I'd like to take you. Like a date? Lena's voice was cautious. Like an opportunity to see art you might not otherwise access with someone who wants to hear your professional opinion. Marco's smile was slight but genuine. If it becomes a date in the process, I wouldn't object, but there's no pressure for it to be anything more than 2 people looking at paintings and arguing about technique. Despite everything, the fear, the confusion, the sense that she was stepping onto uncertain ground, Lena found herself smiling back. I'm very opinionated about technique. I'm counting on it. Marco moved toward the door, then paused. Thank you for letting me see your studio. Your work is even more powerful in person. And I meant what I said this morning. You're not just talented, you're genuinely exceptional. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. He left before Lena could formulate a response, his footsteps echoing down the stairwell. She stood in her tiny apartment, surrounded by her art, $50,000 in her bank account, and a bag of supplies that would last her months, trying to understand what had just happened. Marco DeLuca was dangerous. That much was clear, but maybe not in the way she'd initially feared. The danger wasn't physical violence or criminal complications. The danger was how much she wanted to believe him, how much she wanted to trust that someone could see her work, see her struggle, see her and decide she was worth investing in, worth knowing, worth the risk of catching when she fell. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marco. Pietro wants to know if you ate the food. Also, the gallery showing is Thursday at 8 p.m. No pressure, but I hope you'll come. M. Lena looked at her canvases, at the new supplies, at the space where Marco had stood studying her work with absolute focus. She thought about his words, about destruction and creation being the same process, about transformation requiring both violence and care, about building something outside traditional systems when the systems themselves were broken. She typed back, "Tell Pietro I'm eating it right now, and yes to Thursday, but I'm wearing paint-stained jeans and combat boots. This is who I am." The response came almost immediately. "Good. I don't want you any other way. See you Thursday." M. Lena set down her phone and moved to stand in front of a blank canvas she'd been too exhausted and too broke to approach for weeks. Now, with a full stomach and resources, and the memory of Marco's dark eyes seen straight through to the core of her, she felt something shift, energy returning, possibility opening up, the space between what was and what could be suddenly filled with potential rather than fear. She picked up a brush from the new supplies, selected a color, and made the first mark on white canvas. The painting that emerged over the next hours was different from anything she'd created before. Bolder, more confident, less apologetic about taking up space. It showed a figure suspended between ground and sky, arms outstretched, expression somewhere between falling and flying. The ambiguity was intentional, the refusal to choose between catastrophe and grace. By the time Lena finally put down her brush, the winter sun had set and her apartment was dark except for the single lamp illuminating her easel. Her hands were covered in paint. Her back ached from standing, and she was more exhausted than she'd been in weeks. But it was a different kind of exhaustion. Not the grinding fatigue of survival, but the satisfied tiredness of creation, of having channeled something from inside herself onto canvas, of having been seen by someone who understood the difference between looking and witnessing, and then using that experience to make something true. Lena cleaned her brushes with care, covered her palette, and stepped back to look at what she'd created. The figure in the painting had her face, not obviously, but in the tilt of the head, the tension in the shoulders, the expression that suggested someone learning to trust the air beneath them. Her phone buzzed again. Not Marco this time, but her bank app, confirming that $50,000 had officially cleared into her account. Real money, life-changing money, resources that would give her room to breathe, space to create, options she'd never had before. Lena thought about everything that had happened since she'd collapsed in that ballroom. The fall. The catch. Marco's arms holding her steady while her body failed. The careful attention, the unexpected generosity, the way he'd looked at her work like it mattered. Like she mattered. It was too much, too fast, too impossibly fairy tale to be real. Except it was real. The money proved it. The art supplies proved it. The painting she'd just completed, bold and uncompromising and hers, proved it. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to Marco's contact, her thumb hovering over his name. She could still walk away. Take the money, say thank you, maintain professional distance. It would be safer, simpler, less likely to complicate the life she was trying to build. But when had Lena ever chosen safe over true? When had she ever picked simplicity over the kind of connection that demanded vulnerability? She was an artist because she'd learned to see what others missed, to articulate what couldn't quite be put into words, to translate complexity into something that could be shared. And Marco, dangerous, controlled, impossibly generous Marco, had seen that in her, had recognized not just her talent, but her tenacity, her refusal to be invisible, her determination to create beauty despite circumstances designed to crush it. That kind of recognition was worth the risk. Maybe. Lena typed out a message. I finished a new painting tonight. About falling and flying and not being sure which is which. Your fault, probably. See you Thursday. She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then went to her refrigerator and pulled out one of Pietro's containers. The food was still perfect, rich and nourishing, and made with the kind of care that came from someone who believed feeding people mattered. As she ate, sitting on her second-hand couch in her tiny apartment, Lena felt something unfamiliar settling into her bones. Not quite hope. Hope was too fragile, too easily broken. But possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the fall that had started at a Manhattan gala might lead somewhere unexpected. Somewhere that included full meals and art supplies, and a man whose dark eyes saw through her defenses to the person underneath. It was terrifying. It was thrilling. It was exactly the kind of complication Lena had spent 3 years trying to avoid. But as she looked at her new painting, at the figure suspended between catastrophe and grace, she thought maybe some complications were worth leaning into. Maybe some falls were worth trusting that someone would catch you. And maybe some dangerous men were worth the risk of being seen completely. Thursday. A private gallery. Marco DeLuca wanting to hear her professional opinion while Pietro fretted about empty stomachs and her bank account held more money than she'd ever imagined having at once. Lena finished eating, cleaned her plate, and went back to stand in front of her canvas. Tomorrow she'd return to reality, to classes and thesis presentations, and all the practical concerns of finishing her degree. But tonight, she'd let herself exist in the space between what was and what might be. In the moment of transformation. In the breath between falling and being caught. It was a good place to create from, even if it scared her, especially because it scared her. Her phone buzzed one more time. Marco, I look forward to seeing what falling and flying look like through your eyes. Sleep well, Lena. M. And despite everything, the fear, the confusion, the impossibility of her situation, Lena found herself smiling as she finally climbed into bed, her hands still smelling of paint, her body exhausted but satisfied, and her mind already spinning toward Thursday night, toward possibility, toward danger, toward whatever came next when you let yourself be caught by someone who promised not to hold you too tight. Thursday arrived with the weight of anticipation that made Lena's hands unsteady as she worked on her thesis presentation. She'd spent the past 3 days in a blur of productivity that felt almost surreal. No catering shifts to drain her energy, no anxiety about whether she could afford both food and art supplies, just uninterrupted time to create. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Her classmates had noticed the change. Sophia, her closest friend in the program, had cornered her after critique session that afternoon with suspicion sharp in her eyes. "You're different," Sophia had said, studying Lena like she was one of their studio assignments. "You've got color in your face, you're not shaking from exhaustion, and you just presented 3 new pieces that are better than anything you've done all semester. What happened?" Lena had deflected, made vague comments about finally getting some rest, but Sophia wasn't easily fooled. Rest doesn't put that kind of light in someone's eyes. That's not rest. That's possibility. She'd paused, then added more gently, "Just be careful, Lena. Whatever this is, whoever this is, make sure they're worth the risk." The words had stayed with Lena all afternoon as she'd gone home to prepare for the gallery showing. Now, standing in front of her tiny bathroom mirror, she studied her reflection with critical eyes. She'd kept her promise to Marco about the paint-stained jeans and combat boots, but she'd paired them with a vintage silk blouse she'd found at a thrift store years ago, deep emerald that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she'd applied minimal makeup because anything more felt like pretending to be someone she wasn't. The effect was somewhere between art student and young professional, which felt right. She wasn't trying to fit into Marco's world. She was letting him see hers. Her phone buzzed. "Marco, car is downstairs whenever you're ready. No rush." Lena grabbed her worn leather jacket, another thrift store find, and headed down the 4 flights of stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs. The black car waiting at the curb was the same one from the night she'd collapsed, and Marco stood beside it, dressed in dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that somehow made him look both sophisticated and dangerous. His eyes tracked over her outfit with appreciation. "You look perfect." "I look like myself," Lena corrected, letting him open the car door for her. "Exactly." Marco slid in beside her, maintaining that careful distance that suggested restraint rather than disinterest. "The artist Ethan Cross is showing tonight. Have you heard of him?" Lena's head whipped around. "Ethan Cross? The Ethan Cross who did the Fractured Light series, who got written up in the Times for his installation at MoMA. That's the one. Marco's mouth curved with satisfaction at her reaction. He's a friend. Does private showings sometimes for collectors who appreciate his work without the circus of a public opening. I thought you might want to see his new pieces before critics get their hands on them. Want to see them? Lena's voice came out higher than intended. Marco, Ethan Cross is one of the most important contemporary artists working today. His understanding of spatial relationships and emotional resonance is... She stopped herself, realizing she was about to launch into an academic lecture. Yes, I very much want to see them. Good. Marco settled back against the leather seat, and Lena could feel his attention on her even as he looked out the window. I'm curious what you'll think. His technical skill is obvious, but I've always wondered if the emotional depth people credit him with is actually there, or if critics are projecting what they want to see. The question was smart, insightful, exactly the kind of thing Lena and her classmates debated endlessly in studio sessions. You're testing me, she realized. I'm asking for your professional opinion, Marco corrected. There's a difference. I genuinely don't know the answer, but I suspect you will after seeing the work. The gallery was in Tribeca, housed in a converted warehouse with the kind of understated exterior that screamed exclusive. No signs, no advertising, just a discreet number beside a heavy steel door. Marco entered a code, and they stepped into a space that took Lena's breath away. The gallery was a study in contrast, industrial architecture softened by perfect lighting, concrete floors warmed by carefully placed rugs, soaring ceilings that made the art feel both monumental and intimate, and the art itself. Lena stopped walking, arrested by the sheer power of Ethan Cross's new series. The paintings were massive, each one at least 8 feet tall, showing urban landscapes fractured and reformed in ways that suggested both destruction and hope. They were technically masterful and emotionally devastating, and Lena found herself moving toward them without conscious thought. He's getting better, she murmured, studying the layering technique Cross had used. Look at how he's built up the surface. You can see the history of the painting underneath the final image. It's like archaeology. You're looking at the finished piece, but you're also seeing all the failed attempts, the changes, the evolution. It's brilliant. Failed attempts? Marco moved to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. Not failures in execution, failures in vision. Lena gestured to a section where you could see ghost images beneath the surface paint. He started with one idea, realized it wasn't working, painted over it, started again. Most artists try to hide that process. Cross makes it visible. He's saying that the journey toward the final image is as important as the image itself. Like your palimpsest theory, Marco said quietly. Exactly like that. Lena turned to look at him, surprised he'd remembered. The past informing the present even when we try to cover it. Cross understands that conceptually and technically. And to answer your question, yes, the emotional depth is real. You can't fake this kind of vulnerability. He's showing you his uncertainty, his revision process, his willingness to destroy and rebuild. That takes courage most artists don't have. A voice came from behind them, cultured and amused. Well, that's the most insightful reading of my work I've heard in months. Please tell me you're an art critic so I can quote you extensively. Lena spun to find a man in his early 40s watching them with warm interest. Ethan Cross in person was less polished than his gallery photos suggested. Paint under his fingernails, silver threading through dark hair, laugh lines around intelligent eyes. Ethan, Marco said by way of greeting, this is Lena Hart, artist, final year at Ashworth. Lena, Ethan Cross, who apparently eavesdrops on private conversations. When those conversations are about my work? Absolutely. Ethan extended a hand to Lena, his grip firm and respectful. Ashworth has a solid program. What's your focus? Painting, primarily oils, some mixed media? Lena's voice steadied as she fell into familiar professional territory. I'm working on my thesis series exploring concepts of witness and visibility. The difference between being seen and being observed, Ethan said immediately, and Lena felt a jolt of recognition at finding someone who understood the distinction. That's ambitious. How are you approaching it technically? They fell into conversation the way artists do, technical and passionate and occasionally incomprehensible to anyone not fluent in the language of painting. Marco stood nearby, listening with apparent interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed he understood more than Lena had realized. Ethan showed them through the rest of his new series, explaining his process, and Lena found herself challenging some of his choices, defending others, dissecting technique with the kind of granular attention she usually reserved for studio critiques. "You should come to my studio sometime," Ethan said eventually, and Lena heard genuine invitation rather than polite courtesy in his voice. "I'd be interested to see your thesis work, and honestly, I could use a technical conversation with someone who actually understands what I'm trying to do, instead of just wanting to discuss market value and investment potential." He shot a pointed look at Marco, who raised his hands in mock surrender. "I appreciate your work for both its artistic merit and its financial appreciation. I'm multifaceted." "You're mercenary," Ethan corrected, but there was affection in it. "Though I'll admit, you have better taste than most collectors. At least you actually look at what you're buying instead of just checking provenance and resale projections." Other guests had begun arriving, small clusters of serious collectors, a few gallery owners, people who moved through the space with the confidence of those accustomed to private showings. Lena recognized a couple of names from art world publications, felt herself starting to withdraw into observer mode, but Marco's hand found the small of her back, steady and grounding. "Don't disappear on me," he said quietly, for her ears only. "You belong here as much as anyone." "I'm a student," Lena murmured back. "These people probably spend more on a single piece than my entire education costs." These people probably couldn't articulate what makes Ethan's work significant beyond "it's important because important people say it is." Marco's voice was dry. "You actually understand it. That makes you more valuable than their bank accounts." A woman in head-to-toe Chanel approached Marco with practiced elegance, her smile sharp and assessing. "Marco, darling, I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you were in meetings all week." "Meetings ended," Marco said politely, but without warmth. "Victoria, this is Lena Hart. Lena, Victoria Ashton, gallery owner." Victoria's eyes swept over Lena with the kind of evaluation that cataloged and dismissed in seconds. "How lovely! Are you a collector?" "An artist," Lena said, lifting her chin slightly. "Oh, how wonderful! Always nice to see young people interested in art." The patronizing tone was unmistakable. "What do you do, dear? Watercolors? Mixed media collage?" "Oils primarily," Lena said evenly. "Large-scale figurative work exploring themes of transformation and witness." "How ambitious." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, if you ever want to show in a real gallery, do let me know. Though I have to warn you, the market for emerging artists is quite challenging right now. It takes more than talent to succeed." The implication was clear. Lena might have talent, but she lacked everything else that mattered: money, connections, the right background. Before Lena could formulate a response that was professional rather than scathing, Marco's voice cut through with cold precision. "Lena's work is already spoken for. I've purchased her thesis piece for my private collection, and Ethan's expressed interest in seeing the rest of her series, which I suspect will lead to more opportunities than your gallery typically provides emerging artists." Victoria's expression flickered, surprise, recalculation, something that might have been respect or might have been resentment. "I see. Well, that's quite an endorsement." She drifted away, and Lena turned to Marco with exasperation and gratitude tangled together. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Marco's jaw was tight. "Victoria Ashton is a gatekeeper who's built her reputation on keeping artists like you out while promoting mediocre work from people with the right connections. I've tolerated her because she occasionally shows pieces worth seeing, but watching her dismiss you? That ends my tolerance." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Lena's chest warm. "I can handle condescending gallery owners. I've been dealing with them for 3 years." "You shouldn't have to." Marco's dark eyes met hers. "You should be able to walk into spaces like this and have people recognize your value immediately. That's not naivete. That's how the art world should work if it wasn't fundamentally broken." "But it is broken," Lena said softly. "So people like me learn to navigate around the breaks. We build different paths. We find other ways." Or people like me use their influence to remove obstacles that shouldn't exist in the first place. Marco's expression softened slightly. Let me be angry on your behalf, Lena. You've spent 3 years being gracious about systematic dismissal. Tonight, let someone else carry that weight. The offer was surprisingly intimate, not to fight her battles, but to share the burden of fighting them. Lena felt something shift in her chest, a wall she hadn't known she'd built starting to develop cracks. Okay, she whispered. Thank you. They spent another hour at the gallery, Lena discussing technique with Ethan and a handful of other artists who'd gathered around their conversation, drawn by the depth of technical discussion. Marco stayed nearby but gave her space to engage professionally, to prove she belonged in these conversations not because of his patronage, but because of her knowledge and skill. When they finally left, stepping out into the cold January night, Lena felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in months. Her mind was spinning with ideas sparked by Ethan's work, by the conversations, by the validation of being taken seriously by established artists. That was incredible, she said as Marco held the car door open. Thank you for bringing me. I learned more tonight than I have in some of my classes. You earned your place there, Marco said, sliding in beside her. I just provided the introduction. Everything else was you. The car pulled away from the curb, and Lena realized she didn't want the night to end, didn't want to go back to her tiny apartment and the reality of thesis deadlines and student loan anxiety. She wanted to stay suspended in this moment where she felt seen and valued and possible. Are you hungry? Marco asked, as if reading her thoughts. Pietro will be devastated if I don't feed you properly at least once a week. Lena laughed despite herself. Does Pietro know he's become your excuse for everything? Pietro is the only person who can give me orders without consequence. I'm absolutely using him as an excuse. Marco's smile was warm and genuine. But seriously, dinner? There's a place in the village that makes pasta Pietro actually approves of, which is saying something. I'm still wearing paint-stained jeans, Lena pointed out. Perfect. It's that kind of place. Marco leaned forward to speak to the driver, giving an address Lena didn't catch, then settled back. Tell me what you're working on now. After the painting about falling and flying, what came next? Lena found herself explaining her thesis series, the 5 interconnected canvases exploring different aspects of witness and visibility. Marco listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand her artistic process, not just making conversation. The restaurant was small and warm, tucked into a side street most tourists would never find. The owner greeted Marco by name, led them to a corner table, and immediately began making recommendations in rapid Italian. Marco responded in kind, his fluency surprising Lena yet again. You speak Italian? Pietro insisted, said I couldn't properly appreciate his cooking if I couldn't understand what he was saying about it. Marco's expression was fond. Turns out learning Italian opens up a lot of other useful conversations too. They ordered and wine arrived. That was probably expensive, but tasted like liquid sunlight. Lena took a careful sip, hyper-aware that this felt like a date, despite Marco's assurances that it was just 2 people looking at art and arguing about technique. Can I ask you something? Lena said, liquid courage from the wine making her bold. Always. Why me? And before you say it's about the art, I mean, yes, you bought my painting, but this feels like more than patronage. You're investing time, attention, introducing me to people, defending me to gallery owners. Why? Marco was quiet for a moment, swirling wine in his glass, and Lena could see him weighing how much truth to share. Because when I caught you falling, he said finally, you looked up at me with these eyes that were terrified and grateful, and still trying to figure out how to be strong. And something in that look reminded me of every time I've been in over my head, drowning in circumstances, trying to keep fighting even when my body was giving up. I saw myself in you, Lena. Not who I am now, but who I was at 24. And I thought, what would have happened if someone had caught me then? If someone had said, here are resources, here's space to breathe, here's recognition that your struggle matters? Someone did help you, though, Lena said softly. You built all of this from somewhere. I built it through violence and ruthlessness and doing things I'm not proud of because I had no other options. Marco's voice was low, honest. I hurt people who probably deserved it, but also some who were just in my way. I made choices that kept me alive, but cost me pieces of who I could have been. And when I look at you, at your talent, your determination, your refusal to compromise your vision even when you're starving, I think maybe I can give you the options I never had. The vulnerability in his admission made Lena's throat tight. That's a lot of pressure, to be your redemption arc. You're not my redemption. Marco's dark eyes held hers. You're just someone I want to help because I can, because you deserve it, and because watching you create is the closest I've come to understanding what beauty without violence looks like. Food arrived, saving Lena from having to respond to words that felt too big, too honest, too dangerous. They ate and talked about safer things: Ethan's technique, Lena's thesis timeline, Pietro's ongoing campaign to make sure she ate properly. But the conversation Marco had started hung between them, shifting the nature of everything that came after. By the time they finished eating, Lena had made a decision that was probably reckless but felt necessary. "Come back to my studio," she said. "I want to show you the Witness series in person, and I want—" She paused, gathering courage. "I want you to see me work, actually paint, not just look at finished pieces. You said you wanted to understand the process. I'm ready to let you witness that." Marco's expression shifted, something fierce and pleased moving through his careful control. "Are you sure?" "No," Lena admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The drive back to Washington Heights felt charged with anticipation. Lena was hyper-aware of Marco beside her, of the risk she was taking letting him deeper into her world, of how much she wanted him to understand what happened when she stood in front of a canvas. Her apartment was cold when they entered, the radiator was temperamental at best, and Lena immediately moved to turn on her space heater and work lights. The 5 canvases of her thesis series dominated the main wall, and she watched Marco's face as he studied them in sequence. The series showed the same figure, abstract enough to be universal, specific enough to be personal, being witnessed in different contexts. The first canvas showed the figure invisible in a crowd. The second showed the figure observed but not seen, like an object of study. The third showed the figure exposed, vulnerable under harsh light. The fourth showed the figure reflected in another's eyes, finally being truly seen. The fifth showed the figure witnessing themselves, completing the cycle. "It's about the progression," Lena explained, standing beside Marco. "How being seen changes us. How we can be visible without being witnessed. How true recognition requires both the person being seen and the person doing the seeing to be vulnerable." "The fourth one," Marco said, pointing to the canvas where the figure was reflected in another's eyes. "That's us. That's what happened when you woke up and I was holding you. That moment of recognition." The accuracy of his reading, the way he'd identified the exact moment that had inspired the painting, made Lena's breath catch. "Yes." Marco turned to face her fully. "Show me how you do this. Show me how you take moments like that and make them visible." Lena moved to her easel where a fresh canvas waited. She pulled on the oversized shirt she used to protect her clothes, selected brushes and paints with ritualistic care, and then stood before the blank surface with Marco settling onto her ancient couch to watch. For a moment, the self-consciousness of being observed threatened to freeze her. But then she touched brush to canvas, made that first mark that was always a leap of faith, and everything else fell away. There was only the painting emerging, the dance between vision and execution, the problem-solving and intuition that defined her process. She worked in silence, building layers, establishing composition, losing herself in the familiar trance of creation. Time became fluid, minutes or hours, she couldn't tell. All she knew was the canvas, the paint, the image taking shape beneath her hands. When she finally stepped back, her shirt splattered with color and her hands aching pleasantly, she found Marco watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Intensity, fascination, something that looked almost like reverence. "What?" Lena asked, suddenly self-conscious again. "You transform," Marco said quietly. "When you're painting, you become completely present, completely focused. Everything else disappears. I've never seen anyone so entirely in their element." "That's what flow state feels like," Lena said, wiping her hands on a rag. "When the work is challenging enough to demand everything but not so difficult that you freeze, it's addictive." "I can see why." Marco stood, moved closer to examine what she'd created. "Is this another piece for the series?" Lena looked at the canvas with fresh eyes. She'd painted 2 figures this time, the space between them charged with tension and possibility. One reaching out, one caught between pulling away and leaning in. It was about trust, she realized, about the risk of being seen completely. I think it's something new, she admitted. The beginning of something, at least. Marco's hand found her lower back, warm through her paint-stained shirt. Thank you for letting me see this. Not just the finished work, but the process. The transformation. Lena turned to face him, and suddenly they were very close, the air between them electric with everything they hadn't said. She could feel his breath, could see the careful restraint in how he held himself, could sense him waiting for permission he refused to take without explicit invitation. I'm terrified of you, Lena whispered, of what you represent, of how much I want to trust this. Good, Marco said, his voice low and rough. Fear means you're paying attention, but Lena, I need you to hear this. I will never hurt you. I will never use your vulnerability against you. I will never expect anything you're not ready to give freely. Whatever this is between us, it moves at your pace, on your terms. Always. The absolute certainty in his words, the way he'd just articulated her deepest fears and addressed them directly, made something crack fully open in Lena's chest. She reached up, her paint-stained fingers touching his jaw, feeling muscle jump beneath her touch. What if my terms include wanting you to kiss me? She asked, her heart hammering. What if I'm tired of fighting this attraction because it seems complicated and dangerous and probably a terrible idea? Marco's eyes darkened, his control visibly fraying. Then I'd say sometimes the best things are complicated and dangerous and probably terrible ideas. But I need to know you're sure. That this isn't gratitude or feeling obligated or… Lena kissed him, cutting off his careful words with action. Marco made a sound low in his throat and pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair, the other spreading across her back. The kiss was everything she'd imagined and nothing she'd prepared for. Intense and searching, and somehow both gentle and consuming. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marco rested his forehead against hers. That wasn't on the schedule for tonight. Plans change, Lena said, her voice shaky. Sometimes you have to improvise. Is this improvising, or is this what you wanted all along? Both. Lena pulled back enough to meet his eyes. I wanted it and fought wanting it, and convinced myself it was a bad idea. But Marco, I'm tired of being careful. I've been so careful for so long, calculating every risk, protecting myself from any potential pain. And maybe that's smart, but it's also exhausting. So yes, this is improvising. And yes, it's terrifying. And yes, I'm sure. Marco kissed her again, slower this time, thorough and deliberate. When he pulled back, his smile was dangerous and genuine. We should probably establish some ground rules. Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to simple patronage or professional interest. I don't want simple, Lena said. I want honest, complicated, real. Then that's what we'll build. Marco's thumb traced her jaw. But Lena, my world is dangerous in ways you don't fully understand yet. There are people who would use you to get to me, situations that could become violent without warning. If we do this, I need to know you trust me to keep you safe. Can you keep me safe? Lena asked seriously. Yes. No hesitation. I can and I will, but it means accepting security you probably won't like. It means telling me when something feels wrong. It means letting me protect you even when your independence chafes at the restriction. Lena thought about everything she'd learned about Marco over the past week, the resources he commanded, the respect and fear his name carried, the careful way he moved through the world. She thought about the $50,000 in her account, the opportunities opening up, the future that was suddenly possible instead of hypothetical. Okay, she said quietly. I trust you to keep me safe. And I'll tell you when something feels wrong. But Marco, I need you to trust me too. Trust that I'm choosing this with full knowledge of what it might cost. Trust that I'm not fragile enough to break the first time things get complicated. You're anything but fragile. Marco's expression was fierce. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I just want to make sure that strength isn't tested in ways that could hurt you. Life tests everyone eventually, Lena pointed out. At least this way I'm being tested while someone's in my corner. They stood in her tiny studio, paint-stained and honest and hovering on the edge of something that could change everything. Outside, the city continued its relentless motion, but inside this space, time felt suspended between what was and what could be. Marco's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He glanced at it, and something shifted in his expression, a closing off, a return to the controlled man who commanded rooms and built empires outside traditional systems. "I have to go," he said reluctantly. "Something's come up that needs my immediate attention." "Dangerous something?" Lena asked, new fear spiking through her. "Complicated something," Marco corrected. "Not dangerous for me, but requiring my presence to stay that way." He kissed her forehead gently. "Lock the door behind me. I'll text you when I'm done with this meeting to make sure you're okay." "I've been locking my own door for years," Lena said, but there was warmth in her voice. "I know. Humor me anyway." Marco moved toward the door, paused. "Lena, tonight was perfect. The gallery, the dinner, watching you paint, that kiss that probably shifted something fundamental in my universe. All of it. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me in." "Thank you for being worth the risk," Lena replied. After he left, she locked the door as requested and stood in the center of her studio, trying to process everything that had happened. She'd gone to a private gallery showing, met Ethan Cross, defended her artistic vision to condescending gatekeepers, shared dinner with Marco, let him witness her painting process, and then kissed him like her life depended on the honesty of that connection. It was too much. It was perfect. It was terrifying. Lena's phone buzzed. Marco. "Made it to the meeting. Missing your studio already. Sleep well, artist." M. She smiled despite her racing thoughts, despite the fears she couldn't quite silence, despite knowing that everything had just gotten infinitely more complicated. Because complicated was better than invisible. Dangerous was better than dead inside. And being seen by someone who understood both the cost and the value of creating beauty from struggle, that was worth every risk she was taking. Lena cleaned her brushes, covered her palette, and looked at the new painting she'd started. 2 figures, the space between them charged with possibility, reaching and hesitating, risking and choosing. It was the truest thing she'd painted in months, maybe years. And as she finally climbed into bed, her lips still tingling from Marco's kiss and her mind spinning with everything that had shifted tonight, Lena thought maybe this was what transformation actually felt like. Not the gentle evolution she'd been painting, but the sharp break between before and after. The moment when you stopped protecting yourself from falling and started trusting someone to catch you. It was terrifying. It was inevitable. And she was choosing it with her eyes wide open. The next 3 months unfolded like a painting Lena was creating in real time. Layers building on each other, colors bleeding together in ways she couldn't have predicted. The final image emerging through a process of both intention and surrender. Her thesis show opened to critical acclaim that surprised even her professors, with between breaths commanding attention from collectors and critics who suddenly wanted to know everything about the unknown artist behind such technically masterful, emotionally resonant work. Marco had been there for the opening, standing slightly apart from the crowd, but present in a way that steadied Lena when the attention threatened to overwhelm her. He'd watched her navigate conversations with gallery owners and potential buyers, had seen her hold her ground when people tried to diminish her vision, and had said nothing except, "I told you so," in a quiet moment when she'd finally caught her breath. Ethan Cross had come too, bringing with him the kind of endorsement that opened doors Lena hadn't known existed. He'd stood in front of her thesis series for 20 minutes, then turned to her with serious eyes and said, "You're the real thing. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." 2 weeks later, he'd invited her to show alongside him in a group exhibition at a prestigious Chelsea gallery, the kind of opportunity most emerging artists spent years working toward. The money from Marco's purchase, combined with sales of 3 other pieces from her thesis show, meant Lena could finally breathe. She'd paid off her overdue student loans, covered her rent for the next 6 months, and stocked her studio with supplies that would last through her next several projects. The grinding anxiety of survival had eased, replaced by the different anxiety of possibility, of having space to create without desperation driving every brushstroke. But with the easing of financial pressure came new complications. Marco's world, which she'd glimpsed only in fragments during those first weeks, revealed itself slowly as their relationship deepened. There were phone calls he couldn't ignore, meetings that required his immediate presence, moments when his expression went cold and dangerous before he caught himself and gentled it for her benefit. Lena learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the shift in his voice when something had gone wrong in whatever parallel universe of power and influence he operated within. She learned too about the security that came with being someone Marco cared about, the way certain people suddenly treated her with cautious respect when they realized whose attention she'd captured. The driver who appeared whenever she needed to transport canvases across the city. The discreet figures she'd caught following her twice before Marco had admitted he'd assigned protection after someone had made inquiries about DeLuca's artist. They'd fought about it, Lena's independence chafing against surveillance she hadn't consented to, but Marco had been immovable. "You don't understand what my name attracts," he'd said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "You don't understand what people would do to hurt me through you. I won't apologize for keeping you safe." In the end, they'd compromised. Discreet security when she was moving through unfamiliar parts of the city or attending events related to Marco's world, but freedom in her own neighborhood and daily routine. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. A recognition that Marco's complicated life came with real risks, and that accepting him meant accepting those complications. Pietro had become a constant in her life, insisting she come to Marco's penthouse for dinner at least twice a week, teaching her to cook properly between bouts of dramatic complaints about modern diets and young people who didn't understand that food was love-made edible. Lena had grown to cherish those evenings, the warmth of Marco's kitchen, Pietro's theatrical storytelling, the easy domesticity of sharing meals with people who'd chosen to care about her. But it was the quiet moments she treasured most. Marco appearing at her studio unannounced, settling onto her couch with his laptop to work while she painted, his presence steady and undemanding. The way he'd learned to read her moods, knowing when she needed conversation and when she needed silence. How he'd started collecting images and articles about art techniques he thought might interest her, leaving them on her palette table like offerings. The first time Lena had gone to Marco's penthouse planning to stay the night, she'd been terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. They'd taken their time building toward physical intimacy, Marco's restraint both frustrating and reassuring as he insisted on making sure she was choosing him freely rather than out of gratitude or obligation. When they'd finally crossed that threshold, it had been intense and tender and completely overwhelming. Marco's careful attention to her pleasure, his whispered confessions about how much he wanted her, the vulnerability of being fully seen and accepted. Afterwards, wrapped in sheets that probably cost more than her first car, Lena had traced patterns on Marco's chest and asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Tell me about your father. Really tell me. Not just the public version." Marco had been quiet for so long she'd thought he might not answer. Then, slowly, he'd started talking. About growing up in Red Hook, about watching his father navigate impossible situations with a combination of diplomacy and strategic violence, about inheriting a network built on loyalty and fear and desperate necessity, about the choices he'd made to expand beyond what his father had built, the lines he'd crossed, and the ones he'd refused to approach. "I'm not a good man," Marco had said quietly. "I've hurt people. I've made decisions that kept others safe but destroyed lives in the process. I've built something powerful, but the foundation is blood and compromise and things I can't take back." "But you use that power to help people too," Lena had countered. "You help immigrants who can't access legal channels. You provide banking services for communities that traditional institutions ignore. You protect people who have nowhere else to turn. That doesn't erase the violence, but it complicates the judgment." "You see the best in me," Marco had murmured against her hair. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "You see the best in me too," Lena had replied. "When I was invisible to everyone else, you saw me. Maybe we're even." Now, 3 months after that first fall at the Vandermeer Gala, Lena stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Marco's penthouse, trying to calm the nerves fluttering in her stomach. Tonight was significant. Marco had asked her to accompany him to a formal dinner, not as his artist or friend, but explicitly as his partner. It meant stepping fully into his world, being seen publicly as someone who mattered to him, accepting all the complications and dangers that visibility entailed. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a vintage dress in deep burgundy that managed to be both elegant and artistic, paired with her combat boots because she refused to sacrifice all comfort for appearance. Her hair was styled more formally than usual, and she'd actually spent time on makeup, but the effect was still unmistakably her. Still Lena Hart, artist, refusing to pretend to be anyone else. Marco appeared in the doorway, stunning in a tailored black suit that emphasized his dangerous elegance. His eyes tracked over her with warm appreciation. You look beautiful, he said simply, and thoroughly yourself, which is exactly how you should look. I'm nervous, Lena admitted. This feels different than the gallery showing. This is your world, your people, and I'm going to be introduced as someone who matters to you. That carries weight I'm not sure I'm ready for. Marco crossed to her, turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You don't have to do this. We can stay here, order food, spend the evening exactly as we please. This dinner is important for business reasons, but you're more important, always. No, Lena said, steadying herself. I want to be there. I want to be seen with you. I'm just acknowledging that it's scary to step into visibility when I've spent so long surviving through invisibility. You're not invisible anymore, Marco said quietly. And you never will be again. Not to me, not to the art world that's starting to recognize your talent, not to anyone. You're seen, Lena, completely, and you're valued for exactly who you are. The words settled something anxious in Lena's chest. She reached up to straighten Marco's tie, already perfect, and smiled. Okay, let's go be publicly complicated together. The dinner was at an exclusive restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place that didn't advertise because anyone who mattered already knew about it. Lena recognized several faces from news coverage: politicians, business leaders, people who shaped policy and moved money in ways that affected millions of lives. Marco's hand stayed at her back as they entered, steady and possessive, making it clear to everyone watching that she was with him. The reactions were varied and telling. Some people looked curious, assessing Lena with the careful attention of those trying to determine if she was threat or opportunity. Others looked dismissive, writing her off as insignificant. A few, the ones who'd clearly done their research, looked at her with genuine interest, having heard about the emerging artist whose work was generating buzz in serious art circles. They were seated at a table with 5 others, including a woman Lena recognized as a prominent real estate developer, and a man who ran one of the largest import businesses on the East Coast. The conversation started professionally: market trends, political developments, the kind of high-level discussion Lena had no background in. She listened carefully, trying to understand the dynamics at play, the way power moved through words and silences. And you, Ms. Hart, the developer said eventually, her attention shifting with predatory focus. Marco tells us you're an artist. How fascinating. What do you paint? The question was polite on the surface, but weighted with the assumption that Lena's work was probably decorative and unimportant. Lena had faced this kind of dismissal enough times to recognize it immediately. I work primarily in oils, exploring themes of transformation and witness, Lena said evenly. My recent thesis series examines the difference between visibility and exposure, between being observed and being truly seen. The technical approach involves layering and palimpsest theory, making visible the history that informs the present even when we try to cover it. Palimpsest theory, the import businessman repeated, something shifting in his expression. That's sophisticated conceptual work. Where are you showing? My thesis exhibition was at Ashworth Academy. I'm currently preparing pieces for a group show at Camden Gallery in Chelsea, alongside Ethan Cross and several other established artists. The developer's eyebrows rose. Ethan Cross? That's quite an endorsement for emerging work. How did you secure that opportunity? Ethan saw my thesis show and invited me personally, Lena said simply. He appreciated my technical approach to layering and thought my work would complement the exhibition's themes. Marco's hand found hers under the table, a quiet gesture of support. But Lena didn't need rescue. She'd spent 3 years defending her artistic vision to professors and critics, and anyone else who questioned whether her work had merit. She knew how to hold her ground. The conversation shifted, the other guests now engaging with Lena as someone worth taking seriously rather than Marco's decorative companion. She discussed technique with a woman who collected contemporary art, debated the role of traditional skill in modern painting with a gallery owner, and found herself genuinely enjoying the intellectual engagement. Midway through dinner, Marco leaned close and whispered, "You're magnificent. You know that, right? Watching you command respect through pure competence is extremely attractive." Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her composure. "I'm just being myself." "Exactly," Marco murmured. After dinner, as people moved to a private lounge for drinks and continued conversation, Marco was pulled aside by someone who clearly needed his immediate attention. Lena found herself momentarily alone, studying a painting on the restaurant wall that was mediocre at best, but probably cost a fortune based on the artist's name recognition. "So you're the one who caught Marco DeLuca's attention." Lena turned to find a man watching her with calculating interest. He was perhaps 40, expensively dressed, with the kind of smooth confidence that suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. "I'm Lena Hart," she said carefully. "Robert Castellano. I do business with Marco occasionally." He moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that made Lena's instincts scream warning. "I have to say, I'm curious what makes you special. Marco doesn't usually mix business with pleasure, and he certainly doesn't bring women to professional dinners." "Maybe he decided I was worth the exception," Lena said, taking a deliberate step back. "Maybe." Castellano's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Or maybe you're part of a longer strategy. Marco's very good at strategies, at using people in ways they don't see until it's too late. I'd hate to see someone as lovely as you become collateral damage in one of his schemes." The implication was clear, that Lena was being used, that Marco's interest wasn't genuine, that she was too naive to recognize manipulation when she was drowning in it. Anger flared hot in Lena's chest, but she kept her voice level. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own judgments about who to trust." "Are you?" Castellano leaned in, his voice dropping. "Because from where I'm standing, you're a struggling artist who suddenly has access to money, connections, opportunities you couldn't have earned on your own. That sounds less like romance and more like transaction." Before Lena could respond, Marco appeared at her side, his presence radiating cold fury. "Castellano, I believe Ms. Hart made it clear she's not interested in your commentary on our relationship." "Just looking out for the lady," Castellano said smoothly, but he stepped back immediately, making sure she understands what she's getting into. "She understands perfectly." Marco's voice was deadly quiet. "And if you ever approach her again without invitation, you'll understand exactly how seriously I take threats to people I care about. Are we clear?" Something dangerous flickered in Castellano's expression, but he nodded. "Crystal clear." He walked away and Marco turned to Lena, his jaw tight. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" "I'm fine. He was just trying to get in my head, make me doubt you." Lena took Marco's hand, feeling the tension vibrating through him. "It didn't work. I know who you are, Marco. I know what we are. Some bitter businessman trying to plant seeds of doubt doesn't change that." "Castellano's more than bitter," Marco said grimly. "He's someone I've blocked from certain opportunities, someone who would very much like to see me vulnerable. Targeting you is strategic." "Then he's going to be disappointed." Lena's voice was firm. "Because I'm not a weakness you need to protect. I'm someone who chose you with full understanding of what that choice meant. You can't use me against you if I'm standing beside you instead of behind you." Marco studied her face, and something in his expression softened. "You mean that?" "Of course I mean it." Lena stepped closer, uncaring that they were in a semi-public space. "You think I've spent 3 months learning about your world, accepting your protection, letting you into my studio and my life without understanding exactly what I was choosing? I'm not naive, Marco. I'm deliberate, and I deliberately chose you." "I don't deserve you," Marco said quietly. "You deserve someone who sees you completely and chooses you anyway," Lena corrected. "That's what I'm doing, so stop trying to protect me from yourself and just let me be your partner." Marco pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead that felt like a promise. "Okay, partners. But Lena, if anyone ever makes you feel unsafe, if anyone ever threatens you because of me, I need you to tell me immediately. That's non-negotiable." "Deal. And in return, you need to trust that I can handle conflict without falling apart." Lena smiled up at him. "I survived 3 years of New York poverty and art school critique sessions. I'm tougher than I look." "You're exactly as tough as you look," Marco said, "which is terrifying and impressive and one of the many reasons I'm completely in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, shocking and inevitable at once. Lena's breath caught, her heart hammering against her ribs. Marco looked almost surprised by his own confession, as if the words had escaped before he'd planned them. "You love me?" Lena whispered. "Yes." Marco's voice was rough with emotion. "I love you. I love your talent and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to compromise your vision. I love watching you paint, Love the way you see complexity and translate it into something beautiful. I love that you chose me despite every reasonable instinct that said you should run. I love you completely, Lena Hart, and I'm terrified of what that means. Lena felt tears prick her eyes, joy and fear and overwhelming certainty flooding through her. I love you too. I've been trying not to because it seemed too fast, too complicated, but I can't help it. You caught me when I was falling, and you've been catching me ever since. How could I not love you? Marco kissed her then, deep and thorough and completely inappropriate for their semi-public location. But Lena didn't care. She kissed him back with all the emotion she'd been holding in check, all the vulnerability she'd been too scared to acknowledge, all the certainty that this dangerous, complicated, impossibly generous man was exactly who she wanted. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marco rested his forehead against hers. Let's go home. This dinner is done being important. They left together, Marco's arm around Lena's waist, moving through the restaurant with the kind of united front that made people step aside automatically. In the car, Lena curled against Marco's side, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now we figure out how to build a life together that honors both your world and mine, Marco said. Your art, my business, whatever complications come with trying to merge two very different realities. It won't be simple. I never wanted simple, Lena reminded him. Good, because I'm about to make things even more complicated. Marco pulled out his phone, showed her a listing for a loft space in Brooklyn. This came on the market yesterday. 2,000 square feet, perfect northern light, in a neighborhood that's still affordable for emerging artists but starting to attract galleries. I want to buy it for you. Not as a gift, but as an investment in your career. A real studio where you can work without being cramped, where you can store pieces properly, where you can host the kind of studio visits that lead to serious representation. Lena stared at the listing, her mind spinning. Marco, that's too much. That's me investing in your talent the way any smart patron would, Marco interrupted. You're going to be successful, Lena. Your work is too good, too important not to find its audience. But you need space to create that work. Let me provide that space, not as charity, but as recognition of your value. And what do you get out of this? Lena asked, needing to understand the transaction. I get to watch you thrive, Marco said simply. I get to know that someone I love has the resources to pursue their passion without being ground down by poverty. I get to be part of your success story instead of just observing it. That's what I get. Lena looked at the listing again, the open floor plan, the enormous windows, the exposed brick that would be perfect for hanging works in progress. She thought about her cramped apartment, about rationing supplies, about the constant calculation of whether she could afford to create. And she thought about trust, about accepting help, about letting someone catch you and actually believing they wouldn't let you fall. Okay, she said quietly, but I'm paying rent, market rate, same as I would anywhere else. This is a studio space, not a relationship transaction. I need to know I'm keeping it because I'm earning it, not because I'm with you. Marco smiled, fierce and proud. Market rate rent it is, though I reserve the right to visit frequently and watch you work. Frequently is acceptable, Lena agreed. Constantly would be interfering. Noted. Marco pulled her closer. I love you, artist. Your talent, your integrity, your refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are. You've changed everything for me. You changed everything first, Lena said. You caught me when I was falling. Everything since then has been learning to trust that catch was real. They spent that night in Marco's penthouse, making love with the desperate tenderness of people who'd found something precious and were terrified of losing it. Afterwards, tangled together in sheets that still smelled of expensive laundry and each other, Lena traced patterns on Marco's chest and thought about transformation, about how you could be one person one moment and someone completely different the next, about how falling could turn into flying if someone caught you at exactly the right moment. The next morning, Pietro made them breakfast with even more dramatic flair than usual, muttering about young people and their inability to eat proper meals and love making people stupid and beautiful at the same time. Lena laughed through the entire performance, feeling lighter than she had in years. Over the following weeks, Marco helped Lena move into the Brooklyn studio, the space transforming from empty loft to working artist's dream. Lena threw herself into creating, the freedom of space and resources unleashing something powerful in her work. The pieces she produced were bolder, more ambitious, technically masterful, and emotionally raw. Ethan Cross visited the studio and immediately called his dealer. "You need to see this," he'd said into his phone while standing in front of Lena's latest series. "Yes, I know I said she was talented. I'm upgrading that assessment. She's exceptional. Her work is going to matter." The group show at Camden Gallery was a success that exceeded everyone's expectations. Critics praised Lena's technical skill and emotional sophistication. Collectors inquired about purchasing pieces and commissioning future work. Gallery owners who'd dismissed her 6 months ago suddenly wanted meetings, wanted to discuss representation, wanted to be part of her narrative. Through it all, Marco stayed steady, present but not interfering, supportive but never controlling. He came to her studio and watched her work, understanding now that witnessing her process was the most intimate access she could offer. He defended her to people who tried to diminish her accomplishments by attributing them to his patronage, and he loved her with a fierceness that still took her breath away, even months into their relationship. On a cold evening in April, exactly 1 year after Lena had collapsed at the Vandermeer Gala, Marco appeared at her studio with unusual tension in his shoulders. Lena set down her brushes immediately, recognizing something significant in his bearing. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." Marco crossed to her, took her paint-stained hands in his. "I want to show you something. Will you come with me?" Lena cleaned up quickly, curiosity and slight anxiety warring in her chest. They took Marco's car to the Vandermeer Hotel, and Lena's confusion deepened until they entered the same ballroom where she'd collapsed a year ago. It was empty now, crystal chandeliers lit, but no event in progress. Just the two of them in the space where everything had begun. "A year ago," Marco said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room, "you fell right here, and I caught you, and in that moment, something in my universe shifted. I didn't know your name yet, didn't know about your talent or your determination or the way you see beauty and complexity. I just knew that watching you try to stay strong while your body gave up made me want to give you every resource I had to make sure you never had to push yourself to that point again." "Marco," Lena's voice caught. "Let me finish." Marco pulled her to the exact spot where she'd collapsed, where he'd caught her mid-fall. "This year has been the best of my life. Watching you create, watching your career take off, watching you trust me enough to build something real together. It's been everything I didn't know I was missing. And I want more of it. I want decades of it. I want to watch you become the artist I know you're going to be. I want to be there when your work hangs in museums and when critics run out of superlatives to describe what you've accomplished. I want to catch you every single time you fall, and I want you to catch me when I need it. I want everything, Lena, if you'll have me." He pulled a small box from his pocket, opened it to reveal a ring that was somehow both elegant and artistic, a raw diamond set in brushed platinum, unconventional and perfect. "Marry me," Marco said simply. "Not because I think you need saving, not because I want to control your career or your life. Marry me because we're better together than apart. Because you see me completely, the violence and the compassion, the danger and the care, and you chose me anyway. Because I love you with everything I am, and I want to spend the rest of my life earning that choice every single day." Lena felt tears streaming down her face, joy and certainty and overwhelming love flooding through her. "You caught me," she whispered. "When I was falling, when I'd pushed myself to the breaking point, when I was invisible to everyone else. You caught me. And you've been catching me ever since. How could I say anything but yes?" "Is that a yes?" Marco's voice was rough with emotion. "That's a yes." Lena laughed through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want decades of watching each other create and struggle and succeed. Yes to catching each other. Yes to everything." Marco slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promise and possibility, and the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. When they finally broke apart, both crying and laughing, Lena looked around the ballroom that had witnessed her lowest moment. "We should probably not get married here," she said, and Marco's laugh was pure joy. "Agreed. This is where we started. Let's find somewhere better for the next chapter." "Somewhere with Pietro in the kitchen," Lena suggested. "Somewhere with Pietro in the kitchen," Marco agreed, "and your art on the walls, and everyone we love bearing witness to the fact that sometimes falling is just the beginning of learning to fly." 6 months later, they married in a small ceremony at Marco's penthouse, surrounded by chosen family rather than obligation. Pietro cried through the entire event and served food that made even the most hardened of Marco's business associates weep with pleasure. Ethan Cross gave a toast about the importance of being witnessed fully. Sophia reminded Lena that she'd predicted this outcome months ago. And through it all, Lena felt the steady presence of Marco beside her, dangerous and gentle, powerful and vulnerable, exactly the man she'd chosen. Her career continued to flourish. Major galleries began courting her for representation. Critics discussed her work in terms usually reserved for established masters. She was interviewed for art magazines, invited to prestigious residencies, recognized as one of the most important emerging voices in contemporary painting. But success, Lena discovered, was sweeter when shared with someone who understood both the triumph and the cost. Marco celebrated every achievement with genuine pride, never diminishing her accomplishments by attributing them to his initial patronage. He understood that he'd provided resources, but the talent, the determination, the vision, those had always been hers. 2 years after that first fall at the Vandermeer Gala, Lena stood in the Museum of Modern Art, looking at Between Breaths hanging on a wall alongside works by artists she'd studied in school. The museum had purchased the piece for their permanent collection, a validation that still made her chest tight with disbelief and joy. Marco stood beside her, his hand warm in hers, watching her take in this moment of arrival. "Do you ever think about that night?" Lena asked quietly. "Wonder what would have happened if you hadn't caught me?" "Every day," Marco admitted. "And every day I'm grateful that whatever instinct made me move fast enough to catch you was awake and paying attention. Because this..." He gestured to the painting, to the museum, to everything their lives had become. "This is worth every risk I've ever taken. You're worth every risk." "We're worth it," Lena corrected. "Together, catching each other." She leaned against him, studying her painting with fresh eyes. The figure suspended between breaths, between moments, between what was and what would be. It captured something true about transformation, how terrifying and necessary it was, how you couldn't become who you were meant to be without being willing to fall. But the painting, Lena realized now, was incomplete. It showed the falling, but not the catching. It showed the moment of suspension, but not the hands reaching up to hold steady. It was beautiful, but it wasn't the whole truth. "I want to make something new," she said suddenly. "A companion piece. This one shows the falling. The next one should show the catch. The moment when trust becomes action. When someone decides you're worth the risk of reaching for." Marco pulled her closer. "I'd like to see that." "It's going to be complicated," Lena warned. "Technically challenging. I'll need to figure out how to show the transfer of weight, the shift from falling to being held, how to make visible the exact moment when catastrophe becomes grace." "Sounds perfect," Marco said. "Sounds exactly like us." And as they stood together in the museum, Lena's painting hanging on the wall as proof that impossible things could happen if you were willing to trust the fall, she thought about the year ahead, the new work she would create, the life she and Marco were building together, complicated and honest and built on the foundation of being completely seen. She'd been invisible once, ground down by poverty and exhaustion and the relentless calculation of survival. She'd fallen in a ballroom full of Manhattan's elite, and one dangerous, generous, impossible man had caught her. Everything after that had been learning to trust that catch was real, that being seen was safe, that love could exist alongside complexity and danger and still be worth every risk. Lena Hart had fallen. Marco De Luca had caught her. And together, they transformed that moment into something neither of them could have created alone. A partnership built on witness and trust and the radical act of choosing each other completely. It was the truest thing she'd ever painted. It was the bravest thing she'd ever done. And it was only the beginning of everything they would build together. One brushstroke, one caught moment, one deliberate choice at a time. Ours, they would say when people asked how they'd found each other. Just ours. Simple and complicated and exactly right.